Okay, let's dive right into this incredible explainer of a harrowing maritime disaster. It's a story that tests the absolute limits of human endurance and, honestly, family unity. We're looking at a true survival account, famously titled We're Not Afraid to Die If We Can All Be Together by Gordon Cook and Alan East. This isn't just your standard adventure story. It's practically a masterclass in resilience, crisis management, and the unbelievable strength of the human spirit when you're staring down certain doom. And to really grasp the raw emotional stakes of this journey, we have to start with this profound realization from a 6-year-old boy. Just think about that. He speaks these words at the absolute peak of hopelessness. Imagine, you're in a completely shattered boat, middle of nowhere in a massive ocean, and your incredibly young son looks up at you and says this. It completely anchors the entire narrative. It tells us right away that this isn't just a story about fighting the ocean. It's about what they're actually fighting for. Section 1. Chasing Captain Cook's Dream. Let's rewind a bit and see where this grand, optimistic dream actually started, long before the waves threatened to swallow them whole. This timeline tracks the escalating crisis. It all started with a really peaceful departure from Plymouth, England back in July 1976. The family had this super ambitious goal. They wanted to duplicate the historic round-the-world voyage made 200 years earlier by Captain James Cook. And at first, things were actually going perfectly. By December 25th, they were already 3,500 kilometers east of Cape Town. Despite atrocious weather, they even managed to have a wonderful Christmas holiday together. But they were sailing straight toward the fateful dawn of January 2nd, which is when the weather took a dramatic, violent turn for the worse. Now, I want to point out that this family didn't just buy a boat and wing it. No, they spent 16 years meticulously preparing. They dedicated literally all their leisure time to honing their seafaring skills in the absolute roughest British waters they could find. They had this professionally built 30-ton wooden-hulled beauty named the Wave Walker, and they'd spend months fitting it out and rigorously testing it. They even took on 2 experienced crewmen in Cape Town, Larry Vigil and Herb Siegler, just to help tackle the notoriously brutal southern Indian Ocean. The crucial takeaway here is preparation. This was a highly skilled crew, but they were about to face an unimaginable force of nature. Because as we know, nature always has the final say. Section 2. Disaster strikes the Wave Walker. It's truly terrifying how quickly the ocean overpowered a decade and a half of careful preparation. Get this, by the time they left Cape Town, they were facing alarming waves up to 15 meters high. Just picture that for a second. That is literally as tall as the ship's main mast. They had been dealing with continuous gales for weeks, sure, but it was the sheer vertical size of these massive waves that really signaled the true danger they were sailing right into. Then, the pacing of everything drastically shifts at 6 p.m. on January 2nd. An ominous silence falls over the water. The wind just drops completely, and the sky immediately grows incredibly dark. Right after that, a growing roar follows, and a crowd seemingly towers behind the ship. Except, it wasn't a cloud. It was a rogue wave, almost twice the height of the others, with a frightful breaking crest that was perfectly vertical. This was the moment of impact. A tremendous explosion just shook the deck. The sheer chaos of the strike was absolute. Mary, the captain's wife, threw open the front hatch and screamed over the noise. "We're sinking! The decks are smashed! We're full of water!" The force of that rogue wave was so intense it had nearly capsized the Wave Walker entirely, throwing her masts almost horizontally before a second wave forcefully hurled her upright again. And the human toll in those first few seconds? Absolutely brutal. The captain's head actually smashed into the wheel. He described being aware of flying overboard and sinking beneath the waves, basically accepting his own approaching death. But then, unexpectedly, his head popped out of the water. He somehow managed to grab the guardrails and literally sail through the air into the main boom. He was tossed around the deck like a rag doll, left ribs cracked, mouth completely filled with blood and broken teeth. Yet, and this is a true testament to extraordinary leadership in a crisis, he somehow found the wheel, lined up the stern for the next wave, and just held on. Moving on to Section 3, the desperate fight for survival. We now enter this agonizing, exhausted battle of endurance where rapid triage, engineering, and quick thinking were the absolute only things keeping them afloat. With the starboard side bashed wide open and water just pouring in, survival came down to solving one mechanical problem at a time. Half swimming, half crawling through the debris, the captain found a hammer, screws, and some canvas.
He managed to stretch that canvas and physically secure waterproof hatch covers across those gaping holes. This forced the incoming water to deflect over the side rather than just filling the cabin. This brilliantly illustrates how methodical you have to be. This is the core of effective crisis management.
But of course, the ocean wasn't done with them. They faced a terrifying cascade of equipment failures as the water level kept rising. First, their hand pumps started to choke up with all this debris floating around the cabins. Then, to make matters worse, the main electric pump short-circuited. The water level was rising threateningly. They were pumping, steering, working the radio in this bitterly cold, endless routine, just sending out mayday calls into the void with no answer. They only avoided sinking that very night because the captain miraculously remembered they had a spare electric pump stashed under the chart room floor. Talk about a close call. Section 4. The Courage of Children. Amidst the freezing water, the smashed timber, and those totally unanswered mayday calls, we discover the absolutely incredible psychological resilience of the youngest crew members. This part of the source material is just deeply moving. 7-year-old Sue had suffered severe head injuries when that first wave hit. Her head had swollen alarmingly, she had 2 enormous black eyes, and a deep cut on her arm. But when her dad asked why she hadn't complained about the pain, she simply said she didn't want to worry them while they were trying to save everyone. Let that sink in. Later, moving incredibly painfully, she actually managed to give her father a handmade card. She drew caricatures of her parents, wrote a beautiful message of love and thanks inside, hoping for the best. Her ability to just project optimism in that incredibly dark hour, it provided massive, much-needed emotional fuel for the adults. Which brings us to Section 5, Salvation at Isle Amsterdam. After 36 grueling hours of continuous pumping, and after riding out a secondary storm with an improvised sea anchor they made out of heavy nylon rope and plastic barrels, the narrative entirely shifts to a desperate hunt for land.
At this point, the boat's main rib frames were smashed all the way down to the keel. The wave walkers simply wasn't going to hold together long enough for them to reach Australia. To put their terrifying odds into crystal clear perspective for you, they were stranded in 150,000 kilometers of turbulent ocean, searching for a 65-kilometer-wide target, Island Amsterdam, a tiny French scientific base. It was the ultimate literal needle in a haystack.
Navigating this required absolute precision, but remember, they were working with crippled equipment. They had completely lost their main compass. The captain was forced to use a spare one that hadn't even been corrected for magnetic variation. Factoring in his best estimates for the westerly currents of the Indian Ocean, he checked and rechecked his calculations. Ultimately, he went up on deck and asked Larry to steer a desperate course correction to 185 degrees. He told him, with a conviction he later admitted he did not actually feel, that they might see the island at about 5 p.m. Well, 6 p.m. rolls around. The captain awoke with a heavy heart, utterly convinced they had missed the island. But then the cathartic release finally comes. The children rush in. Little Jonathan asks for a hug, calling him the best daddy in the whole world and the best captain. When the very confused captain asks why, Sue delivers the miraculous news. You found the island. They practically flew up on deck, and there it was, finally appearing on the horizon, looking as big as a battleship. Now to this exhausted, severely battered crew, Island Amsterdam was pure salvation. Objectively, it was just a bleak piece of volcanic rock with very little vegetation and only 28 inhabitants. But as they anchored offshore for the night, just waiting to be cheered ashore the very next morning, the captain reflected on it. To them, in that moment, it was undeniably the most beautiful island in the world, because it meant they had survived. It meant the incredible, unyielding optimism of his crew and the staggering bravery of his 7-year-old girl and 6-year-old boy had not been in vain. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final, provocative thought straight from the analysis of this amazing text. After seeing the shattered ribs of the boat, the frantic pumping, and a family pushed to the absolute brink of death, why did people undertake such adventurous expeditions in spite of the life-threatening risks involved? What is it about human nature that drives us to leave the safety of the shore and challenge the vast, unforgiving ocean? Take some time to really think about that, and what you might do if you were ever tested by the sea.